Hey, so let's talk about chapter 11 in Sosa. I want to point out, like, this is a stupid starting word. Never start a paper like that. Okay, now let's get to the actual content. I want to kind of just run through the first half of it at a fairly brisk pace. What Sosa says he's up to in this chapter is epistemology as an attempt to understand the relation between epistemic coherence and intellectual virtue at the foundation of epistemology. And it's not entirely clear what that means. So, but keep in mind what's like this basic idea as we go through this paper. What Sosa wants to understand is what connection there is between coherence and reliability. Okay, so those are the concepts we're going to be trying to understand the connection between. Okay. And where he wants to start off is just thinking very generally about justification, which he says is the central concept of epistemology. And the type of justification he's interested in is the particular type that it takes to have knowledge. There's other sorts of justification around. And one of the things he wants to point out is that being justified in this sense is going to share in the supervenience of the normative and evaluative generally. And what he means by that is that the kind of justification we're interested in studying in epistemology is such that there are some features that cause beliefs to be justified, and any other belief with the same features will be equally justified. In the same way that an apple that is, say, juicy, sweet, and large is a good apple, and any other apple that is equally juicy, sweet, and large will be equally good. Okay, so that's an analogy he makes with the apple thing. And the point is we're trying to figure out what are those features that if a belief has them, the belief is justified, and any other belief that has the same features will be equally justified. We're trying to find such things, and he's going to call those things justification-making properties, although my experience is he doesn't actually make a ton of use of this term, except in the very next section, which is about internalism and externalism. Internalism is the view that whatever it takes to make a belief justified, whatever these features are in virtue of which a belief becomes justified, they are inside us. They are things that we can have access to just by reflecting on the contents of our mind. So the justification-making properties of any justified belief must be internal to the mind of the subject. So they're just in your head. Those are the kinds of things that the sorts of things that it takes for a belief to be justified are things that go on inside your head. Not everything that goes inside your head is relevant, but the things that are relevant are going to be things inside your head if you buy internalism. Externalism says there's going to be stuff outside your noggin that matters. Okay, and the first point Sosa wants to make is that internalism is not intuitively compelling. It is not a compellingly obvious thing to accept. And you might wonder then, why should we accept it? This is a question he's asking. And he answers the question on the next page. And it's basically just a response to a certain type of skeptic. And the skeptic we have in mind is someone who will not say you're justified unless you have proof. And we mean by proof, we mean definitive proof. And Sosa points out, if that's what we're after, if real justification does require proof, then it's plausible that any time a belief is justified, you can tell it's justified just by reflecting. And so that's a reason you might be an internalist, is because you're trying to respond to the skeptic, and what the skeptic is demanding is proof. And so that kind of forces you to take internalism on board. And we call this sort of view a Cartesian view, or Cartesianism. But what Sosa wants to point out is that Cartesianism has been universally abandoned. And he gives 3 reasons why Cartesianism has been abandoned. The first one is that it gives some weird ontological consequences. Okay, and then he kind of throws that reason out. Another reason is because it just leaves us with too little. If the only things we accept are things we have proof for, well, then we won't be accepting very much. And so we've restricted the scope of knowledge massively, and we're just not giving a plausible account of what knowledge is. And so the natural thing to do there is to kind of, well, just don't abandon Cartesianism wholeheartedly, just like sort of loosen it up. And so you have a more modest version of Cartesianism. And you look at how modest you need to be, and it turns out you need to be quite modest and allow quite a bit. And no matter how you resolve that, you end up not being an internalist anymore. You're going to have to allow things outside just your noggin to count as justification-making properties. Okay. Then he looks at the third option, and the third way to break with Cartesianism is this most radical break, he says. And he describes it fairly well down here. He says that no belief is ever justified simply by being an accurate reflection. A further meta-belief is also required. So you have to have a belief about your belief in order to be justified. And of course, that meta-belief has to be justified as well, and you end up in this infinite regress. Okay, so that's sort of the third way to break with Cartesianism. You end up with a regress there, which isn't great, but those are our three options, it seems like. Now, so recall that right now we're investigating internalism as one of the options on the table, externalism being the other, and we tried to figure out why we should be internalist, and it was because, well, we might be like responding to a Cartesian, and if you're responding to a Cartesian, you might look at like ways to sort of break Cartesianism, and we looked at three options. And now we're going to say, well, like, what if we weren't quite internalists, but we were very close to internalists? What options are on the table? And so here we're going to look at contextualism. And the idea of contextualism is that a belief is justified just if it represents the conclusion of valid reasoning. That is, what it takes to be justified is to have a valid reason for belief. And the problem is that if what you're looking for is valid reasoning, well, valid reasoning starts somewhere. It has premises. And so you're always only going to be justified relative to a context. And the context is defined by what premises you're currently accepting. And of course, you can't keep going. You can't honestly, validly reason all the way back to the starting point, because you have to stop somewhere and have premises that you're accepting. And the problem that raises is this that he brings at the bottom. Superstition on this view will be just as much knowledge relative to the assumption of superstition as is knowledge based on observation or memory relative to a position that says those are okay. So on the contextualist view, these things are just on a par, right? Like, yeah, sure, this can count as knowledge if you take these premises on board, and that can count as knowledge as you take other premises on board. And the issue is that just strikes us as wrong. Superstition doesn't give rise to knowledge. It may give rise to beliefs. It may give rise to very fervently held beliefs. It doesn't give rise to knowledge. Okay, and so he kind of concludes this part by saying that we've considered these three views of justification. We have Cartesianism's view that gives us deduction from the manifest. We have this sort of doxastic assent where you have belief, and in order to have the belief work, you have to believe your belief, and you have this like assent that gives us an infinite regress, and then we have this contextualist option. These are sort of the three versions of essentially internalist views that we looked at. None of them were all that appealing, and so we're going to stop talking about internalism and look at externalism. Okay. Now, according to externalism, the factors that justify your belief don't have to be discoverable merely by reflection. And one compelling view in the area is that what makes a belief justified is roughly that it is reliable, that it regularly leads you to truth. Okay. And now we want to think, how do I come to know that a belief is reliable? And Sosa gives the obvious answer. It would seem to be a matter for observation in science to determine whether or not a particular perceptual faculty leads reliably to truth. So if I want to know whether this or that way in which I'm forming beliefs is reliable, well, I just investigate the matter using, science and observation and that kind of thing. But there's an issue here, and he says we need to look more closely at it, and we'll see the issue. If what we do is we just try to do an induction, we say, like, well, here's the faculty I'm using to justify my beliefs, and observe that it frequently leads me to truth, you just, maybe you test the faculty a whole bunch of times and you see that it keeps leading you to truth, there's an issue that comes up. And the issue is that it seems circular. And the way Sosa kind of spells this out is down here. So suppose this is basically how we do it. We have this source of belief, and we say, well, this source of belief emits all and only these beliefs. Okay. And we say, hey, look, they're also all true. And we conclude on that basis that this source of belief S is reliable. So that's like roughly speaking how we imagine we're going to use science or something like science to sort of come to the belief that S is a reliable source of belief. The problem is that if I use that argument, well, if you list premises in support of a conclusion, you're advancing them not only as true, but as justified. And so if we look up what that means here, Sosa says, what is vicious about this argument in as providing justification for its conclusion is that when you advance the second premise as justified, you must presuppose the truth of the conclusion. And so if we look at this, we have two premises and one conclusion. And what we say is, well, given that I use source S to arrive at these beliefs and that those beliefs are true, source S is reliable. Now, the issue is this, I'm assuming, is justified when I present it to you in support of my conclusion. But if it's justified, how did it get to be justified? Well, presumably because source S is the thing that emits my beliefs in those H's. But that's exactly what I'm concluding, is that this thing reliably leads me to truth. And so I can't advance this as a justified premise unless I've already assumed that this is true. So the argument ends up being just a question beggar. You're just begging the question. Well, what recourse is left? So like, we can't just say like, it's science. That's how we figure out that our various sources of belief work. And one option, of course, is to just say like, some of what we call fideism. You just say, these cognitive faculties work, I promise. You might try to do that. But as Sosa points out, the superstitious could match trust with trust. So the superstitious could say, well, I've done the same thing. I just chosen a different basis. And so then we would have nothing to say in response to that. And that's not the position we want to be in. So we should look somewhere else. And here's something that's tempting. Okay. And so he says, in extremis, even the philosopher may perhaps be allowed to appeal to the practical. This is sort of a joke. When you're under duress and things are going really badly, even a philosopher can maybe appeal to the practical value of something. And he gives some examples, William James and apparently Kierkegaard. I think it's more useful to look at his example of Sellers down here. He says, a philosopher stretching an extremis to the practical for objective ground may be Sellers, when he concludes that if his argument, whatever the hell it was, is sound, it is reasonable to accept that what were these? IPM judgments are introspection, perception, and memory judgments are likely to be true simply on the ground that unless they are likely to be true, the concept of effective agency has no application. So here's roughly how Sellers' argument goes. It seems like I can get my way around in the world and try to do things and generally be effective at accomplishing the things I try to do. Not always, but like I can try to get this book off the shelf and lo and behold, I can succeed. Look, I effectively went and grabbed this Harold Pinter volume off of the shelf. Great. Now, if I cannot reliably trust my faculties, then my belief that I can reliably do things is senseless, right? So the concept of effective agency, the concept that I can effectively move myself around in the world is just no good. It doesn't make any sense. Okay. And so Sosa asks, how should we interpret this argument? He says, well, roughly what's happening here is we want effective agency. I want to believe of myself that I can do stuff. But it seems like I can only have it if my perceptive faculties work. And so it's in my interests to believe that my perceptive faculties work. I'm going to pause the recording. Something seems to have gone wrong. Okay, sorry about that. So it's in my interest to think that my perceptive faculty works. And it's very much in my interest. Without that belief, it seems like I can't conceive of myself as an agent wandering around the world with desires that I can potentially accomplish, right? And so that's Seller's rough argument for why we should trust our perceptive faculties. Because if we don't, then we can't visualize ourselves as agents in the world, and we really want to do that. But that's not much of an argument. He says, look, the issue is that it just isn't rational belief generally. Hang on again. This time I'm not going to pause the recording. I'm just going to do this. I'm not sure why my business isn't working. Okay, roll on down here. There we are. Too far. Okay, it's not rational belief generally that constitutes knowledge. So it might be that Sellers is right, that it's rational for me to believe that my perceptive faculties work. And the reason it's rational is because if I don't believe it, then I can't see myself as an effective agent. And it's just irrational for me to go about in the world not thinking that I'm an effective agent, thinking that I'm just being blown about by the wind, right? That would be an irrational way to go through life. So you rationally ought to believe that your perceptive faculties work. And what Sosa points out is like, look, being rational is not good enough for being knowledge. You need more than that. Knowledge requires an appropriate justification on a certain restricted basis of reasons. What it's best for us to believe, all things considered, and what the evidence point to, these things need not coincide. It may well be the case that once in a while it's best for us to believe something even though all the evidence points against it and even though it's false. Sosa imagines this situation. What if the evident and the things that it's expedient or that it's really convenient to believe coincide super systematically? Would that then give us a foundation for knowledge? Would that mean that the what did he say? The expedient in the way of belief would count as knowledge? And he says no. The way he gets there, he says, imagine this society of wishful thinkers who flourish thereby. Like, it's just like this weird possible world where like people just wish for things and just, it turns out that when people wish for things, it comes to pass that's what happens. And, you know, wishing for things just goes really well for these people. So let's just imagine this, not just one person like this, but this whole society of people like this. Sosa says that wishful thinking, even then, still would not be a source of cognitive justification. Why? Well, because it's just the wrong sort of thing. So let's see if we can find exactly how he says it. Such justification could not possibly turn out to be a property that a belief might have in complete independence from the truth of its object. Right? Cognitive justification could turn out to be such a property of a belief if mere wishful thinking could provide it. So mere wishful thinking could not be a source of cognitive justification. Now, what Sosa says is like, look, there could be these worlds in which rational agents should ignore knowledge in favor of other things. So like maybe in this wishful thinking world, the rational agents ought not be interested in knowledge. And that might be the case. Okay, fine. That being so, it doesn't make their wishful thinking based beliefs knowledge just because it doesn't make sense to look for knowledge. Okay. That's the end of A through G. Next up, we'll talk about the rest of the paper. Thanks.